getting a job depend on how good you are and what experience and qualifications you've got, or is it more about being in the right place at the right time? The answer you give to questions like this could reveal much more about your personality than you'd ever guess. And the man who discovered this was Julian Rota.
Jules's great contribution was to bring personality theory into the area of clinical psychology.
It was here at the University of Connecticut that Julian Rota devised the test which was to make him famous within psychology. A test that's still used today, the External Locus of Control, or IE scale. It's been used in research on everything from how gamblers place bets to who does the right thing in a tornado.
The IE scale was an instrument that allowed you to measure what was inside people's heads in terms of their expectancy of what might happen in this situation, and expectancy predicts behavior. So it was a way to predict behavior in a variety of situations.
I remember in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was doing my literature review for my dissertation, we didn't have the bibliographic searches that we do now, and it took a very long time. Even then, there were just thousands of studies that had used this construct of locus of control. As a theory, it's had tremendous outreach and impact.
It's appealing, it's intuitive. It is the case, people say, I am where I am because I'm fortunate and I've been lucky in the world. And other people say, I am where I am because I am a striver. And you observe these things.
It really affects how we think about individual motivation, how we think about beliefs about the world. There's a whole school of treatment, cognitive behavior therapy, which is very much evolved from notions like generalized expectancy, locus of control, expectations that people have about their capacity to influence their own life.
When I first studied psychology, I have to confess that I used to assume that everyone in textbooks who'd come up with a famous theory must be dead by now. But Julian Rota is very much still here, and at 95 still lives close to the University of Connecticut, where he came to head the clinical psychology training program back in 1963. In Mind Changers, I'm lucky enough to get to meet some of the greats in psychology, and Julian Rota is definitely one of those. So I've come to his house in the woods, where he's lived for 55 years, to meet the man himself. Do you remember how you very first came up with the idea?
It was a student, graduate student, who was doing psychotherapy, and I was supervising him. Whenever anything good happened to this patient, the patient would say, well, that was just luck. But if anything bad happened to him, he'd also say it was luck, only he didn't talk about those things. And I was trying to explain to myself why his expectancies didn't go up as he got better. It occurred to me that some people, that when he said it's just luck, that he really believed that. So I began looking into the whole notion. Was that a personality characteristic which is relatively stable, or wasn't it? The best way to find that out was to build a test.
That test consisted of 23 pairs of statements. Your task is to choose which of the pair you believe to be most true. So how about this? Which of the following fits in with your beliefs? A, many of the unhappy things in people's lives are partly due to bad luck. Or B, people's misfortunes result from the mistakes they make. And which of these next two do you most agree with? A, in the long run, people get the respect they deserve in this world. Or B, unfortunately, an individual's worth often passes unrecognised no matter how hard he tries.
I think he was particularly influential in thinking about what constitutes an adequate theory of personality and bringing to bear scientific notions so that we developed theories that were verifiable and measurable and testable.
I've come to meet Marion Barton at the University of Connecticut, who is now Director of Clinical Training here, which is the job that Julian Rota had when he was here.
locus of control is embedded in his broader theoretical framework, social learning theory. In the context of social learning theory, Jules articulated this notion of generalized expectancies, which are beliefs about how things work in the world. And one of them is this notion of locus of control. So some people have an internal locus of control, meaning that they believe that their actions affect the outcome of events, that they can make a difference in the outcome of their life. Other people have an external locus of control, meaning that they have a generalized expectancy that their actions or behavior are unlikely to influence the course of events. And individuals with an internal locus of control can be expected to behave in certain very predictable ways that are distinct from individuals with an external locus of control.
What sorts of differences do you see between those people?
As you might anticipate, people with an internal locus of control tend to be sort of go-getters, more ambitious. They are perhaps less prone to depression because they believe that they can affect things. At the far extreme, individuals with an external locus of control may be vulnerable to something called learned helplessness, the belief that they simply can't affect the outcome of things in the world, and that is related to depressive illness.
It was published in 1966. I remember back in the mid-60s, I would go to a psychology convention, and the largest number of sessions were on the IE scale.
Charles Lowe, now Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut, is a friend and former colleague of Julian Roter's.
And that's because it was an era when most psychologists were going into people's heads. And here's a measure of internality. So it became very, very widely used.
Jules is very modest, and he presented his social learning theory to us, including locus of control, as an interesting idea and a model for an empirically based theory of personality, but certainly not as an earth-shaking concept or something that would really, in many ways, define the progression of clinical psychology.
Were you surprised at how it did take off?
Yes. It was like walking through the woods and lighting a cigarette and throwing the match behind you, and then you keep on walking, and then you turn around and you see this huge fire behind you. You think, my God, how did that happen? But then I thought, the idea that what you do has consequences is really not some new brilliant idea. It's something that's been around along with civilization for a long time.
But you found a way of testing that and of pinning it down to something much
Yes.
more precise, really.
Well, yes. And it's worked out very well. But there were at least 5 years of research before I even published the test to find out which items were really the better items.
It's his enormous commitment to thorough scientific research that sets Julian Roter apart as a clinical psychologist, according to Charles Lowe.
Until Jules came along, research and clinicians did not go together. And Jules said, you know, this is not right. Clinical psychology needs to be a research-oriented discipline.
I think he thought that science kept the clinician honest, but that clinicians kept the scientists humble and aware of the enormous complexity of human behavior.
And he played quite an important part in the development of clinical psychology himself, didn't he?
He did. And Jules was one of the very first clinical psychologists ever trained in this country. He participated in what's known as the Boulder Conference in 1949, at which a model was articulated for the training of clinical psychologists. It includes training as both a scientist and a practitioner.
The influence of the scientist-practitioner model extends to the training of clinical psychologists in the UK too. But in the US, Julian Roter's impact is enormous because of his groundbreaking ideas, but also because he taught for such a very long time.
I worked until I was about 82.
That's a long
Well, I
time.
kept on teaching. It's not work. I enjoyed that more than anything else I did. I have a lot of ex-students, including my wife.
One of the reasons why Jules is so influential is because he has had literally hundreds of master's and PhD students, and many of them became heads of departments. You know, this ripple effect.
Toffee Roter is his wife and a former student.
He taught the two best courses I ever had in my life in anything. If you were able to talk to all the clinical students he's ever taught, they would name these two courses. One was on theories of personality, and the other was on test construction and validation. And that course, is just a gem.
Yet it's the design of Julian Rota's own test that's come in for some alteration and even criticism over the years. At Brandeis University near Boston, Professor Margie Lackman, director of the Lifespan Developmental Psychology Laboratory, told me that her own work on how our feelings of control change as we get older has been directly influenced by Rota's locus of control, but with some modifications.
The dichotomy of internal-external was not necessarily the only aspect of control that was of importance. A number of scholars developed more dimensions. For example, there was work by Hannah Levinson and Herbert Lefcourt that differentiated external control into two components, into the chance or the luck component and the powerful others component.
What's the powerful others?
Powerful others refers to believing that the control over outcomes in your life is really determined by other people who have a lot of influence and power, such as teachers or doctors. Another really important observation that many scholars made is that his locus of control instrument had forced choice. They were dichotomous items. And many people would say, well, I don't know if it's A or B. It's really somewhere in between. And so this is one of the modifications. Instead of having forced choice, they constructed items where you could really endorse both an internal and an external orientation at the same time.
The goal of any personality test is to find the extremes. Who is very external, who is very internal. That's meaningful because those different types differ. People who are in the middle, they're not representative of any particular trait, and so it's not as useful. So Jules would be very careful when he constructed a test. For example, here's an item. I love my mother more than my father. And your answer would be?
No, I love them the same, of course.
Yes. See, that doesn't force you into an extreme. So that test is no good, and you just gave the socially desirable answer. You love them both. That's swell. But the kind of questions in Jules's test, people were saying what they truly felt and what they thought they should say.
The internal-external scale, whether as Rota originally intended or in a modified form, has been used widely, but often without reference to the theory that informed it, and that means it's not always used correctly. Doffy Rota.
The theory gets lost because there's this nifty test.
It's the reason the test gets all the attention, that it seems to make so much sense to people, so it's memorable.
It is memorable and it is useful, and I've used it. And I think it's very good, but if you read his social learning theory, when he talks about generalized expectancy, he's talking essentially about a stable personality trait, and that's important.
Jules's theory said what will predict whether you do a particular behavior or not is a combination of expectancy. If I do this, what can I expect? And reinforcement value. If I do this, what will be the possible rewards? Now, in most cases, people walk into a situation, much like we met a few minutes ago, and you have an expectancy that's based on that situation. Now, obviously, you pretty much know what to expect in an interview situation. So your specific expectancy about the interview situation will dictate what you do. But what happens when you have not been in a situation, when it's a bit novel or a bit ambiguous? Then Jules said it's that generalized expectancy, which is very much like a personality trait, that really dictates behavior, and that's where internality and externality comes from. People try to apply that generalized expectancy concept to specific situations, and it just doesn't work.
I think there's always a tendency in psychology to oversimplify concepts like this. I think we do tend to overinterpret locus of control as a very broad tendency, but that goes against everything we know about human behavior. If we could come up with a broad tendency that would explain behavior in every circumstance, that would be lovely, but wouldn't be very consistent with who we are as people.
So what are the sorts of situations where people have tried to apply it, but you say it's too specific and it wouldn't work?
For example, academic success. Do internals do better in academia than do externals? Doesn't apply, because students have specific expectancies in most academic situations. How do you take an exam? How do you write a paper? And so generalized expectancy doesn't have a chance to operate.
So it doesn't matter whether they think that they can have more impact over how well they do. I mean, won't that make them revise more if they think that they can change how they do in their exam?
Not in specific situations. Experience takes over.
So hundreds and hundreds of studies have used the locus of control scale, but might be using it, some of them, in the wrong way.
They use it in the right way to measure internality and externality. When they go to apply those measures to behavior, sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't.
What's an example where it would work?
It will work when you go into a situation where you've never been before. What might that be for you? I don't know. Have you ever been to a weight club?
No, I haven't.
Well, there
No.
you go. If you're an internal, you'll go and take charge and do some things. If you're an external, you'll wait for somebody else to show you what to do.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what a weight club is, so I probably would have to wait for someone to show me what to do. But surely, whether you believe you have control over life all depends on what experiences you've had. If you've got money, the world's your oyster, and might feel more controllable. If you haven't, opportunities are more limited. So is there an argument for saying that the locus of control is little more than a proxy for socioeconomic status? Margie Lackman.
Many aspects of these control beliefs emerge early in life through the way parents respond to your behaviors, whether or not teachers respond with contingent reinforcement. If you can see that there is a connection between what you do and how people respond and what rewards you get, you begin to learn this relationship. What we find in adulthood is that those people who come from high socioeconomic status positions, who have high levels of education, are more likely to have a high sense of control. Yet, what's really interesting is that some people in low socioeconomic groups do have a high sense of control. And we've been able to show that their health looks comparable to those who have high socioeconomic status. So there's something about these beliefs that allow them to be resilient and overcome some of the limitations that they would typically face in their environment. Understanding how that happens, I think, is a really promising direction for future research.
Locus of control has been used a lot in health research. John Weinman is Professor of Psychology as Applied to Medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry. He's based at Guy's Hospital in London.
The original locus of control measure was very much people's perceptions of control almost at a trait-like level. So health locus of control went for a very specific version of that. Where do people perceive control in terms of their own health? Before that was developed by Kenneth Walston, Hannah Levinson had already broadened external, being then split into chance and powerful others. And that obviously very much worked in the medical setting where powerful others typically were doctors, healthcare providers, and so on. So it sort of fitted quite well to start with. But then I think quite rapidly people realized that actually just as perceptions of control in one area of your life don't necessarily mirror perceptions of control in another area, exactly the same happened in the health field. So perceptions of control, let's say, over one's lifestyle or one's day-to-day behavior, which could influence your health, might be very different from perceptions of control over a certain disease or even a certain aspect of a disease, like pain or adherence to treatment.
We've come down to the haematology unit now at Guy's Hospital, and I wanted to ask you how the whole idea of control is used in practical terms in hospitals today.
Well, I'm going to introduce you to a colleague of mine, Dr. Nicky Thomas, who's a consultant health psychologist working exclusively with patients with sickle cell disease. And Nicky's work is obviously very much focused on helping patients to cope with the demands of a very intrusive and unpleasant disease in which control over symptoms and pain and a whole lot of other effects are really important.
Hi, Nicky.
Hi.
Why is control so important when it comes to this particular disease?
Well, because the main symptomology is pain, and pain comes very unpredictably. So when you talk to patients, they'll say to you, I can't get on with my life because I'm going to college or I'm managing my family, and the pain comes, knocks me for 6, and I'm back in hospital again. The main element of our work is enabling people to get a sense that they are having some control over their life. They may not have ultimate control over their health, but they have control over some aspects of their life. Things that they would prioritize as important. So it may be important for them, say a young person, to go to college. And with working collaboratively with their college tutors and so on, they can achieve small, achievable goals. When you start achieving those goals, that enables you to realize, yeah, things are possible. And you go on, and before you know it, they are in control of big areas of their lives.
So for you, the whole concept of locus of control that Rhoda talked about has continued to be important all these years later in healthcare today.
Absolutely.
And do you find big differences between individuals in how much they feel they're in control?
As with any situation, there are variabilities in how we manage our situation. Some patients, we feel that we have to work a little bit more closely in a more tutorial kind of a way to help them to think differently about their situation. And the main therapeutic intervention we utilize is cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps people to think differently about their situation.
There seem to be a lot of advantages in having an internal locus of control, that people achieve more, they're less likely to smoke, they're more likely to join civil rights movements, they're less likely to conform. There seem to be all sorts of things that would often be seen as positive. Are there any situations where the people with an external locus of control do better?
People who are more external are less likely probably to feel guilty. Guilt is a problem. If you feel that everything that happens to you is because of what you've done and things don't go right, then you're guilty.
Much of the research that we've done shows that those people who have a higher sense of control seem to do better and function better in so many different domains. Yet, there must be some importance for being more realistic in the sense of you can't control everything, especially in later life. Acknowledging that and not taking responsibility for some of the outcomes may actually be advantageous. For example, there's been some work on widowhood where they found that adults who had a very high sense of control after they were widowed looked more depressed, they had lower levels of well-being. However, in the long run, it turns out that those who had a higher sense of control seem to recover more quickly, and they seem to be more resilient.
So this would suggest that there is no benefit to being an external.
I have searched in my studies, I've always looked to see if we can find some evidence that those who have a higher sense of control will not fare as well as those who have a lower sense of control. And I really don't find much evidence for that.
But the good news is that your locus of control is not completely fixed. With a little help, you can change it if you want to. Professor Marianne Barton.
We go about challenging what we now think of as a broader system of dysfunctional beliefs. So we would ask people to keep track of some of these beliefs, of times when they might be unconsciously or preconsciously thinking about what they anticipate to be the effect of their decisions. We would ask them to think about how they might have developed some of these expectations, and then we would challenge them to just try this one time to behave as if it were not the case. And often that results in significant changes.
In this culture, of course, it was good to be internal and bad to be external. But the fact is that there are a lot of things that I can't control and you can't control. I knew that from the beginning. I didn't have some kind of good-bad discrepancy.
So you were never assuming that everything can be controlled by
no,
the internals?
No, and I never assumed that it was good for everybody to be way up there on the 90th percentile of being internal.
Would you say you've had quite an optimistic view of human beings and their potential to change if they want to?
No question in my mind that people change, and they can change. Major events like marriage changes people. Birth of children changes people. Losing a job, getting a better one, all those things change people.
How easy is it to change from having an external locus of control to more of an internal one? Even to move up the scale a bit?
I can't tell you that. And the reason I can't is because I'm probably higher on the internal side than I should be or than I need to be.
Internal or not, to get a picture of the man himself, I turned to one of his oldest friends, Jerome Smith, emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut and a former head of the psychology department.
Those were heated meetings. The division heads met because they were all interested in the amount of support they could garner for their graduate students. Other division heads would argue and scream, and Jules was always very quiet, very persuasive, and non-aggressive. It was always wise, considerate, and he suffered fools. A lot of people don't suffer fools, but he suffered fools when it was to the benefit of the department.
I don't think I can remember a single other eminent psychologist I've featured in Mind Changers being described as suffering fools gladly. It's almost a standard description that they don't. For Julian Rota, it wasn't all work. He believes in keeping fit and was still playing tennis and squash regularly well into his 80s, and poker too.
He was a good poker player. The reason he was not a great poker player is that he didn't care about the winning.
Would you say he's one of the great thinkers in psychology?
Not to his face. I mean, I don't want him to get that swelled ahead with things. I think he's one of the better thinkers in psychology.
I think he's in the top 10, maybe the 12th most cited psychologist in the 20th century.
Do you remember the very first time you met him here?
Yes. My first day on the job, I walked by his office and he said, "Hello there, come in, please." So I walked in and we spent an hour just chatting about the University of Connecticut and about personality theory, clinical psychology, the relationship between personality and social psychology. I was just overwhelmed that somebody of the stature of Julian B. Rota would take time out to talk to this young person walking in as a colleague. For maybe the next 25 years, Jules and I had a regular tennis date or squash date every single week.
Who would win?
He would. At first. But you know what? After 25 years, I began to win a few.
Did you ever guess that you were going to end up being one of the 20 most eminent psychologists in the world of all time?
No, I don't know about all time either.
Those articles are looking at all time. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, no. It occurred to me that one of my characteristics was that I was always interested in asking questions and trying to find the answers, not in trying to get ahead. It wasn't that I have anything against getting ahead. I like it. What I was interested in was answering questions.
You can have a similar situation. You can work in the same environment, and yet two people may feel that they are more or less likely to get the desired goals or desired outcomes that they're expecting. And a lot of that has to do with how you perceive the situation, how you expect things to turn out. And this is really what Rota was so instrumental in pointing out to us, that it's these expectancies that you bring to the situation that interact with the objective nature of the situation that will determine not only what the outcome is, but how hard you try, how anxious you are in the situation, and ultimately how things turn out.